Hello and welcome to this session. We continue to discuss Tennessee Williams' play, The Glass Menagerie. So this is a play we noted that where it is seen as a memory play. So there are many uses of memory for various purposes over here. It could be wish fulfillment, it could be conflict resolution, it could also be resilience. This will become more and more evident as we progress through the play. And the play begins with a recollection by the narrator, and then it shifts into the play without an interrupting narrator. And this is very interesting, which we had already noticed, where the narrator becomes a commentator too. Narrator becomes someone who's giving stage directions as well, and he is also configuring the characters in such ways to suit his emotional temperament. This is a term coined by Williams, and this could be seen as a continuation of the stream of consciousness technique, where we find that the narrator is taking the course of the play forward depending on these random associations in his mind. So memory here also becomes a device of oppression. So we find that while the realist techniques are being used, the play also borders on a lot of non-realist elements, because it is entirely based on one character's memory, on the narrator's memory, who also holds the reins of this play in some sense. So memory, the way it functions in this play, it largely functions as a device of oppression while not allowing the characters to move forward. So now, even when, for instance, even when Tom Wingfield is out of this family setting, it's his memories which are holding him almost like a captive, like a hostage in this family situation itself. And Laura and Amanda, they are both oppressed by their own memories, one with this idyllic past and the other one in this fantasy world, which also becomes an extension of her memory. Right, so these are the major characters. Tom Wingfield, who is the narrator of the play, he's an aspiring poet. He works in a shoe warehouse, but he's frustrated with his routine job, and he wants to do something more creative, something more interesting, for which he does not get ample support from his family. There is this instance where he's trying to get some creative work done, but his mother is also really annoyed at him for retaining a copy of D.H. Lawrence from the library, and there are these different moral compulsions at work which is not allowing him to either fulfill his obligations to his family or seek his own fortune or do whatever his heart wants. So he finds this his escape through these various modes. He watches films every night, and sometimes he takes he reads literature which is seen as filthy by his mother, and of course there's alcohol. So this escapism is also symbolically presented in the recurrent presence of the fire escape, the steps near the fire escape. Amanda Wingfield is Tom's mother. She seems to have had a very elite, genteel upbringing in the South, but she was abandoned by her husband, because he wanted to travel. He fell in love with the distances and left the family. That is what the play tells us. And there is this very comfortable, glorious past to which she clings on to, because that's where she finds her identity. That's where her identity continues to be anchored in, and she thinks that she had a past where she was this very charming presence, and she had up to 17 suitors on a single day, and she's wishing the same kind of comforts for her children, but she's also anxious that they are not really going to make it because they don't have the charm, they don't have the dogged perseverance that she thinks that she had. Laura Wingfield is Tom's elder sister, and she wears braces on her legs, and she's seen as a cripple by the society. She sees herself crippled too, but her mother refuses to acknowledge this reality and seems to believe that with the extra charm she will be able to make up for whatever she does not have at the moment. So her personality is very shy. She chooses to live in her own unreal world, and she finds comfort in this collection of the glass figurines, from which the title is also drawn from, The Glass Menagerie. And she willingly withdraws, very deliberately withdraws from every single connection that will keep her in touch with reality. The way she stopped going to her typewriting lessons, and she instead just took walks in the parks. In that process losing the family's money and also putting her mother to a lot of stress and anxiety. Yeah, and Jim O'Connor, a character who's introduced as at the beginning, with as the only realist character over here. He's a school acquaintance of Tom and Laura. He was a very popular guy in school, and Laura had a crush on him during the school days, but it never became anything. And Tom brings him home, hoping that he would be a potential suitor for Laura. But things do not work out well because he's already engaged, and that also leads to a lot of conflict within the family. Jim O'Connor is that character who comes across, who makes a comeback from the high school lives, of characters as a haunting presence. This is something that we find in The Death of a Salesman too. There are these characters from high school who make a comeback, and at that time the unequal ways in which they are positioned in the social hierarchy, it becomes a source of conflict, another source of conflict within these families. And there is Mr. Wingfield, who's introduced as a fifth character, who's there but not really there. He's just an exaggerated, a larger than life photograph in the living room. So he had abandoned the family, and he is presented as a very handsome and charming man whose charms are being invoked whenever Amanda is inhabiting this unreal past. He does not make any appearance in the play. We do not get to know him except for this the way in which he's presented as an extremely good-looking man, very charming but entirely useless for his family, someone who abandoned his family to pursue his own pleasures. And we will never get to know what kind of person he was and why he really abandoned his family, because the only interpretation, the only way in which we are introduced to this character is through the eyes of Tom Wingfield, the narrator. And here again, we can draw some parallels with the earlier plays that we had read in terms of the father figures, how out of sheer desperation and helplessness they just abandon everything and find recourse in sometimes in suicide, sometimes they just choose to run away. Yeah, so this is seems to be a recurrent thing, in the plays of the 1930s and 1940s, where the male figures, when they fail to take up their responsibility, when they fail to fulfill their responsibilities and familial obligations, yeah, it leads them to take a lot of desperate actions. Yeah. So as we noted before, the play is set in St. Louis in 1937 in a dingy apartment, and these are the characters who are being introduced to us. And this play is not much about the actions which happen. It's more about the psychological turmoil and maybe a kind of an act of atonement that Tom Wingfield is hoping out of this. Yeah, so we need to be aware of the historical context of this play before we continue to go back and do a close reading. The play is set in the late 1930s, particularly 1937. This is again the time of the Great Depression, when America was struggling with the after effects of the Great Depression, and the real time, the time in which the play is being written, that's also the war time. Yeah, so this is a twin kind of trauma which gets replicated in different ways in this play. So there is this huge, massive unemployment that these different families are facing. There are poor working conditions and forced labor, a lot of strikes, yeah, and some of them even use that as a bargaining tool, and there's a general unhappiness among the workforce. This is the same unhappiness and frustration that we find gets replicated in Tom Wingfield's character too. So when Tom Wingfield first shows up, he is in this merchant marine uniform. So there were always these working class men who were looking for a career somewhere out there, someone which would give them an escape from their immediate realities. Yeah, so a lot of them found refuge in these merchant marine jobs, which began in the US in the 1936. It was primarily for the purpose of delivering troops and military supplies to Navy ships during wartime. So again, here too, like All My Sons, we find that there is a kind of prosperity that war gives to. Yeah, it's a very uncomfortable kind of prosperity in some sense, but it also gives an escape route from the various other financial and emotional and familial realities that these young men are facing. So the play also, it's implied from the beginning that he also joins one such merchant marine company in order to run away from his family. So we do not know whether how to classify these different acts of running away, how his father runs away and how the now Tom Wingfield also runs away, unable to fulfill their obligations to their families. And this is the helplessness which this play tries to capture by staying rooted in reality, but also using the memory tropes. Yeah. So coming back to the idea of the memory play again. So in memory plays, the emotional turmoil, it becomes easier to capture the emotional turmoil that the characters are going through. So although memory play technically is meant to give more prominence to the emotions, to the psychological trauma, we find that in the plays set in the 1930s and 1940s, it also captures the reality of the Great Depression really well. Yeah, and this is that combination, the combination of this historical background and what happens in the memory, in the minds of these characters. It gives it makes this a telling commentary on the psychological life as well as the public life of the characters. And we are also being introduced, we are being made familiar with a lot of pathetic lives where people try hard to negotiate within the family and outside the world. Yeah, it is this trap that they are caught into. What they are trying to escape is this in between space where they're unable to bring together the expectations of the family and the opportunities that they get outside. We find Tom Wingfield being placed in such a situation where he's unable to grapple with the realities within his home or outside over there. While he's aware of his his obligations, he cannot find a means to reach that or a means to bridge the gap between the expectations and what is available to him from outside. So this is how Tennessee Williams describes a memory play. The scene is memory and therefore non-realistic. So this is how Tennessee Williams himself describes the memory play as. He was the one who coined the term. The scene is memory and therefore non-realistic. Memory takes a lot of poetic license. It omits some details, others are exaggerated. According to the emotional value of the articles it touches, for memory is seated predominantly in the heart. The interior is rather dim and poetic. There are other plays too which have followed a similar format, like Harold Pinter's Old Times, No Man's Land, Betrayal, and Landscape. Brian Friel also has Dancing at Lughnasadh and Faith Healer, which also function as memory plays. And there's also a play by Hugh Glennett, yeah, titled Da. Yeah, so this becomes a very favorite trope for a lot of these playwrights to experiment with these spaces between reality and what happens in the mind as a memory. So these are some of the major themes that this play addresses. There is a difficulty in accepting reality. We find that all characters face that in various ways. Even Jim O'Connor, who's seen as the most realist of these characters, even he chooses to inhabit a tiny pocket of time where he wants to hide the fact that he is already engaged to be married. Yeah, so there is also this oscillation between illusion and disillusionment, which plays out differently in different characters' life, but at the end of it, they are all equally disappointed, they are equally helpless. The theme of abandonment in real as well as metaphorical ways, and finally, the theme of escape, yeah, which is the fire escape being the most symbolic presence of this. Yeah. So all these characters, they find it very difficult to accept and live in reality. In fact, we find that if we go through the play and close read it, at every stage we can find characters who are embodying these different themes, though perhaps in slightly dissimilar ways. So now when we are trying to come back and close read this second act, second scene, we here find that again Amanda first appears on the fire escape steps. Yeah, there's some sort of a crisis which is about to begin. Yeah. So as we discussed before, the fire escape is the symbolic presence of being trapped, of and aspiring to escape. Yeah. Tom, Amanda, and Laura, they're all facing this in different forms or the other. Tom wants to escape the job, the situation, the family situation that he is in, and he wants to escape from every single aspect of the life in which which he is part of at the moment. And Amanda is always waiting for this gentleman caller who will rescue. This gentleman caller almost has this, a Godot kind of quality, who may or may not come. And Laura wants to move away from this real world. Yeah, she wants to go to some outer world which has absolutely no semblance to reality. That is what gets manifested in the way she is presenting when she is, the way she is obsessing over these glass figurines. So when this play begins, when this scene begins, we find that Amanda is not her usual self. She is not she's not chirpy over here. She's not, there's some real crisis that she is facing over here. And she keeps talking about deception, deception, deception. She slowly removes her hat and gloves, continuing the sweat-suffering stare. And this is making Laura very worried too. She begins to shake and she is trying to understand what happened. And Amanda and Laura have this conversation over here. Perhaps, one of the most real conversations that they have in this play. I thought that you were an adult. It seems that I was mistaken. It's also one of those very few times when Amanda, inhabits a slice of reality, a pocket of reality. Yeah? So she gives so if you recall, there was a typewriter where Laura was asked to practice in scene 1. So this typewriter becomes a site of contestation over here. Yeah. So apparently Amanda went to the typing instructor and introduced myself as your mother. She didn't know who you were. Wingfield, she said, we don't have any such student enrolled at the school. I assured her she did, that you had been going to classes since early in January. I wonder, she said, if you could be talking about that terribly shy little girl who dropped out of school only after a few days' attendance. No, I said, Laura, my daughter, has been going to school every day for the past 6 weeks. Excuse me, she said. She took the attendance book out and there was your name, unmistakably printed, and all the dates you were absent until they decided that you had dropped out of school. I still said, no, there must have been some mistake. There must have been some mix-up in the records. And she said, no, I remember her perfectly now. Her hands shook so that she couldn't hit the right keys. The first time we gave a speed test, she broke down completely, was sick at the stomach, and almost had to be carried into the washroom. After that morning, she never showed up anymore. We phoned the house but never got an answer. While I was working at Famous and Bar, I suppose, demonstrating those. Oh, I felt so weak I could barely keep on my feet. This is a moment when reality strikes. Yeah? And Amanda is having all those unpleasant and harsh thoughts about future. $50 tuition, all of our plans, my hopes and ambitions for you. Just gone up the spout like that. Laura draws a long breath and gets awkwardly to her feet. She crosses to the Victrola and winds it up. Yeah. So here, this moment when she inhabits reality for a very brief time also catapults her back to the idea of the gentleman caller as the only option available. There's absolutely no way in which her daughter can find security, financial security, by finding herself a job, because she had dropped out of school. Yeah, she was getting panic attacks while she was there, and while she's trying to understand what Laura had been doing all these whiles when she pretended to attend those classes. She says, I've just been going out walking, yeah, mostly in the park. And also she says, I went to the art museum, the bird houses, yeah, and also, the big glass house where they raise the tropical flowers. This is also very interesting because at some level, maybe she sees herself also as a tropical flower who can be raised only in this unreal world, who can thrive, who can even survive only in this glass house unreal world. Yeah. So this glass house again resonates with the title of the play, Glass Menagerie, the glass figurines, yeah, the world where Laura would ideally want to inhabit, but again, it's not a habitable world. We know that there is absolutely no way in which we can have access to that world except through this, through one's imagination. Amanda is using a very strong word over here, deception. And we find that both her children, in some form or the other, in varying degrees, they betray her just the way her husband had. Yeah, they abandon her, they deceive her, they move away from her control. Yeah, just the way her husband did. And this, and Laura and Tom, they both have their own justifications for that. And one could be fairly certain that perhaps, even the father had his own justifications and interpretations to this act of escapism that he had resorted to 16 years back. Yeah, so Amanda is looking very disappointed, and this is the kind of suffering that Laura can't take it either. Yeah, so this brief moment when Amanda is inhabiting this reality, she says, so what are we going to do the rest of our lives? Stay home and watch the parades go by? Amuse ourselves with the glass menagerie, darling? Eternally playing those worn out phonograph records your father left as a painful reminder of him? We won't have a business career. We've given that up because it gave us nervous indigestion. What is there left but dependency all our lives? I know so well what becomes of unmarried women who aren't prepared to occupy a position. I've seen such pitiful cases in the South. Barely tolerated spinsters living upon the grudging patronage of sister's husband or brother's wife, stuck away in some little mousetrap of a room, encouraged by one in-law to visit another, like bird-like women without any nest, eating the crust of humility all their life. Yeah, here let me also briefly recall another wonderful story of the American South. Yeah, A Rose for Emily by William Faulkner, where the lives of women in the American South are portrayed so beautifully, where what happens to a woman even when she tries to live independently without the presence of a male figure. So it is that paranoia, that anxiety which comes out through Amanda's words. This could be, it may or may not be true. It could be a very different setting that they are inhabiting, but this is the anxiety which is eating Amanda up. Yeah, is that the future that we have mapped out for ourselves? I swear it's the only alternative I can think of. It isn't a very pleasant alternative, is it? Of course, some girls do marry. So this is how they land on this possibility as the gentleman caller, as the only emerging possibility, as the only future that they could have. And it's in such ways that we need to position Jim O'Connor. Yeah, he is the only way in which they could redeem themselves. Yeah, they could have a future. Yeah, and that's the kind of importance that Jim, who was also this high school hero figure for Laura. That's how he enters this scene. And she also remembers that Jim used to call her as Blue Roses, and again there is this slightly sad story, a background story to this. I said Blue Roses and he thought I said Blue Roses. Yeah, so they never went out together, and he also he was with another girl, and she thinks they must be married by now, but then it surprises her as well as the audience when he shows up again as a one potential suitor. There's again this brief moment when they inhabit the world of reality, yeah, where Laura says, I'm crippled, and Amanda is reprimanding her. Laura, I've told you never to use that word. Why, you're not crippled, you just have a little defect, hardly noticeable. Yeah. So right after that, we find that Amanda is now back to occupying her world of illusion. That's where she thrives, and this is perhaps this is the world from which Tom is fleeing to. Yeah, it is quite possible to assume that it's this oscillation between reality and the mythical idyllic world of the past that Tom Wingfield also finds difficult to inhabit and difficult to accommodate. Yeah. So with this we bring this session to an end, and we will continue discussing the play in the forthcoming sessions. Yeah. Thank you for your time.